Everyone knows Superman's origin story. An orphan from the planet Krypton crash lands on Earth and grows up to become the greatest superhero of all time. But what you probably don't know is that the original version of Superman was a bald, telepathic supervillain bent on world domination. Only later did he turn into the handsome, flying superhero we know today. But whether as a villain or a hero, Superman was shaped by the experiences of his creators, two Jewish teenagers from poor immigrant families. Together, they escaped into the worlds of their imaginations, where even the most unlikely people could have secret superpowers. So, who are the guys who invented Superman, and what is his true origin story? The story of Superman's creation starts during the Great Depression in Cleveland, where two awkward teenagers didn't exactly fit in. They were both shy, they both wore glasses, and they definitely didn't talk to girls or play sports. Basically, a couple of Clark Kents. This is Mark Nobleman, author of Boys of Steel, the creators of Superman. He was inspired by how two boys who came from nothing created the most iconic superhero of all time.
Jerry Siegel was the writer, Joe Shuster was the artist. They were good friends, classmates, lived in the same neighborhood, and had the same driving interest, which was science fiction.
Jerry and Joe were both first-generation Jewish Americans. Their parents had fled European anti-Semitism and arrived in a new land in search of a better life. But for Jerry and Joe, growing up during the Great Depression meant a childhood full of struggle and uncertainty.
Joe would be desperate to draw and have no paper on hand sometimes. It was not an expense that his family could necessarily afford, so he would draw on whatever he could get his hands on. And one thing I remember hearing about was the backs of wallpaper, scraps of wallpaper that hadn't been used.
Jerry's family suffered its own share of tragedy and hardship when his father suddenly died of a heart attack. They were devastated by the loss, and without his income, they struggled to get by. It's no wonder why Joe and Jerry enjoyed escaping into the world of science fiction. It was only a matter of time before the writer and the artist decided to team up to create their own stories. Soon came the very first version of Superman.
The first version was done for a story that was not published. It was just one of their many works as teenagers, called Reign of the Superman. And in that story, he was called Superman, but he was a villain.
It's a pretty dark story, actually. A scientist recruits a poor man in a bread line for an experiment that gives him telepathic superpowers. He can read minds, control thoughts, and even see the future. This Superman uses his new powers to seize money and power, eventually murdering the scientist to get rid of his only rival. But then, the powers wear off, and with the scientist dead, there's no way to get them back. So this proto-Superman ends up with nothing and returns to the bread line. It's interesting to speculate about what inspired this dark version of Superman. The idea of a Superman was already in the air at the time, largely inspired by Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, an idealized person who represents the next stage of human evolution. In Germany, the Nazis twisted this idea into their ideology of a so-called master race. Perhaps it's no surprise that Jerry and Joe's first instinct was to paint a Superman as a villain. But soon they reimagined Superman as a hero from another planet, a powerful protector of the innocent with bulletproof skin, who can leap great distances, jump 20-story buildings, lift tremendous weights, and outrun a speeding train.
They were inspired by circus strongmen that were popular in the 20s who wore skin-tight outfits. That's partly where the Superman costume came from. They claim to have named Superman Superman not because of Nietzsche, but because they wanted a symbol on his chest, and they chose an S for their own last names, Siegel and Schuster, and said, well, we can't call him Siegel-Schuster Man, so they picked another word that starts with S that would make sense. That's one version of the origin of his name.
They gave Superman a secret identity to help him blend in, a disguise that may seem familiar to those paying attention.
Clark Kent was modeled on themselves. They chose a persona, a secret identity for Superman that would really throw people off. And they said the farthest thing from Superman would be someone like us. So they made Clark somewhat nebbish and mild-mannered.
But Superman wasn't just modeled on their personalities. The whole story seems to carry traces of Jerry and Joe's lives, two Jewish kids from immigrant families who grew up feeling like outsiders. Take Superman's origin story. His parents sent him away from his home planet as a baby just before it was destroyed. He lands on Earth where he's raised by strangers, and grows up to become a savior. Sound familiar? It's almost beat for beat the biblical story of Moses.
There is a parallel between Superman and Moses. They were both sent away by their parents as infants and raised by strangers and learned only as adults their destiny to be a savior. So when people hear that and see it laid out like that, they often assume that Jerry and Joe created Superman deliberately as a Moses allegory.
Did Jerry and Joe really do this on purpose? We don't know for sure. They never said so directly, but the connection is hard to ignore. But Superman doesn't just echo Moses. He also mirrors the experience of so many Jewish immigrants. Joe and Jerry's parents fled their faraway homes in Europe, where their entire way of life was facing destruction. They arrived in a new world, trying to blend in while hiding their secret Jewish identity. That's the story of Superman escaping the planet Krypton before its destruction, only to start a new life on Earth.
Science fiction, up till then, is about a human going to a strange world or a strange place. This was a stranger coming to a human world, so they flipped it. Superman was walking among us and was the outsider. The humans were the majority and the alien was the immigrant, was the newcomer, and maybe felt unwelcome at times or like he didn't fit in. That was different.
Even Superman's Kryptonian name has a Jewish ring to it.
Superman's Kryptonian name is Kal-El, which to an English speaker means nothing. But if you were to translate it from Hebrew, it could mean all that is God or all that God is. Did Jerry and Joe choose Kal-El because of their Jewish heritage? We don't know.
Whether or not it was intentional, it feels like there's a deep connection between the story of Superman and the story of the Jewish experience. The Man of Steel came from the hearts of two young men raised on Jewish stories of struggle, resilience, and hope. And those same values kept them going, even when no one wanted to publish their little comic. They faced years of rejection before they finally got their big break. An editor at national periodicals finally said yes. He offered them $130 in exchange for all rights to Superman. They sold all rights to Superman, the biggest superhero of all time, for $130. It was the opportunity they'd been waiting for, but it was also a deal that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As Superman would prove to be a cash cow for its new owners, Jerry and Joe would fight many legal battles over the decades to try and regain a share of the profits of their creation. But at least for now, to these two young, struggling artists, felt like a dream come true. They were finally getting paid to do what they loved.
That began a 10-year relationship with national periodicals where they wrote and drew Superman and got paid well, especially considering it was still the Depression when Superman debuted.
Superman officially debuted in Action Comics #1, and he was a giant hit from the start. National periodicals eventually became DC Comics, and Superman went on to become the most famous superhero of all time, inspiring generation after generation. In 2014, a copy of Action Comics #1 sold for over $3 million. Not bad for something that started on scrap paper. Superman has a universal backstory that still resonates today. At his core, he's more than just a superhero. He's the ultimate immigrant success story. He's a symbol of resilience, justice, and hope. His origin is a story of sacrifice and survival that's as old as the Jewish people. And his creators infused him with echoes of their own lives, the struggles of immigrants, the fight to belong, and the belief that even an outsider can make a difference. At the end of the day, you don't need bulletproof skin or X-ray vision or the ability to fly. All you need is your imagination, and you can change the world.